What happens to democracy when a country faces a crisis so severe that the normal rules no longer seem strong enough? One political thinker believed he had the answer. His fingerprints are on Brexit, on Trumpism, on Putin's foreign policy, on the BJP's rise in India, on the intellectual circles of Silicon Valley's most powerful venture capitalists. He's quoted in U.S. Supreme Court briefs. He's cited by left-wing radicals in Spain and right-wing nationalists in Hungary, sometimes in the same week. His name was Carl Schmitt, a German jurist whose work became closely tied to the Nazi regime and was used to legitimize Hitler's consolidation of power. And he was one of the most penetrating political thinkers of the 20th century. That's not a contradiction we get to escape. That's exactly the problem. Carl Schmitt was born in 1888 the Rhineland Catholic, conservative, and an outsider in Protestant Prussia from day one. He became a constitutional law professor, and he chose the worst possible moment to be brilliant. Because between 1919 and 1933, Germany was conducting the most dramatic political experiment in modern history, the Weimar Republic. The first real attempt at liberal democracy in German history. It lasted 14 years. Then it voted itself out of existence. Schmitt watched all of it from his desk. And he wrote obsessively, precisely about why liberal democracy was heading toward collapse. Not because he wanted to save it, because he thought the collapse was correct. In 1922, he published Political Theology. In 1923, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. In 1927, his masterwork, The Concept of the Political. Each one was a scalpel. Each one cut into the assumptions liberals didn't know they were making. Then, in 1933, Hitler took power, and Schmitt, who had not previously been a Nazi supporter, joined the party within weeks. He became what people called the crown jurist of the Third Reich, the regime's most prestigious legal mind. He wrote legal defenses of the Knight of the Long Knives, that's Hitler, ordering the murder of his own political allies to consolidate power. Schmitt called it justified. By 1936, even the Nazis had grown suspicious of him. Rival party members accused him of being a cynical opportunist who converted for career reasons. They weren't entirely wrong. He was ousted from his position of influence. He kept writing. After the war, he was briefly detained for potential Nuremberg prosecution. He was never allowed back into a university position. He lived until 1985, 96 years old, never once apologizing for any of it. And in his study, year after year, young intellectuals from the left and the right, from Europe and America and Japan, made pilgrimages to sit with him. The dangerous old man who understood something about power that everyone else was too comfortable to say out loud. Okay, let's get into the actual philosophy, because this is where it gets interesting and uncomfortable. Schmitt had a lot of ideas, but three concepts are what made him immortal in both senses of the word. The friend-enemy distinction. Here's the question that starts everything. What is politics? Most people, if you ask them, will give you a warm answer. Politics is how we resolve disagreements peacefully. It's the art of compromise. It's democratic deliberation. It's the public pursuit of the good life. Schmitt says, that's a fairy tale. Politics, at its irreducible core, is the distinction between friend and enemy. Now, important clarification. He doesn't mean personal enemies. He doesn't mean you hate these people or that they're morally evil. The enemy, in Schmitt's sense, is simply the other, a group different enough from yours, in an intense enough way, that conflict becomes a real possibility. The enemy is whoever your group defines itself against. Every political community, Schmitt argues, is built on this line. You know who we are because You know who they are. Take away the enemy and you don't get peace, you get the dissolution of the political entirely. This is where people usually object. But can't we just cooperate? Can't politics be about shared values rather than opponents? And Schmitt has a brutal answer. Go look at history. Every time a state claimed to represent universal humanity rather than a particular group, every time a power said, "We're not fighting for our interests, we're fighting for all of mankind," what happened? The violence got worse, because if your enemy is the enemy of humanity itself, they don't deserve political recognition. They deserve elimination. The liberal attempt to transcend the friend-enemy distinction doesn't abolish it, it makes it more dangerous. Sit with that for a second. Sovereignty and the exception. Schmitt's second big idea is about sovereignty, and it starts with one of the most famous sentences in political philosophy. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. What does this mean? Liberal constitutions are built on the idea that the law is supreme. No person, no government, no president is above the law. The rules apply to everyone equally. Power is constrained by procedure. Schmitt says, great theory. Watch what happens in a real crisis. When an actual emergency arrives, a war, a revolution, an attack on Parliament, the Constitution cannot interpret itself. Someone has to decide what counts as an emergency. What normal rules can be suspended? What extraordinary measures are justified? That person, that moment of pure decision, reveals where power actually lives, not in the constitutional text, in the will of whoever acts when the normal framework breaks down. And here's the trap. Once you declare a state of exception, there's nothing in the law that forces you to end it. In 1933, Hitler used the Reichstag fire, an arson attack on the German parliament, to declare a national emergency. Schmitt helped write the legal justification. Civil liberties were suspended. Temporarily. The temporary exception lasted 12 years. It ended with the complete destruction of Germany. Schmitt wasn't horrified by this. This was, for him, the truth of politics revealing itself. Emergency is not the exception to normal governance. It is governance, unmasked. The crisis of parliaments. The third idea is maybe the most relevant to right now. Schmitt wrote in 1923 that parliamentary democracy, government, through debate, reason, and public deliberation had become a lie. The theory is beautiful. Elected representatives gather, arguments are made, the best reasoning wins, policy reflects the public good. The reality, Schmitt said, is that parliaments are theaters. Decisions are made in back rooms. Party machines whip votes. Industrial interests pay for outcomes. The speeches are performances, nobody's mind is being changed. And here's the thing, can you really argue with him? In 1923? Or in 2026? Schmitt's conclusion was that the legitimacy of parliamentary government had evaporated. A system that claims to derive authority from rational public debate but doesn't actually conduct rational public debate has no foundation. He didn't argue for better parliament. He argued that the concept was bankrupt. Here's an argument Schmitt made that I want to spend extra time on because it's the one liberals are least prepared to answer. We talk about liberal democracy like it's one thing, two words that obviously go together. Schmitt said, they don't go together. They're in permanent tension, and that tension is going to keep producing crises. Until you admit it. Liberalism is about protecting individuals and minorities from majorities. Rights that no vote can remove, courts that can override popular will, constraints on what democracy is allowed to do. Democracy is about popular sovereignty. The people decide, majority rules, the will of the many governs. These coexist comfortably in calm times. But when they conflict, What wins? When a majority votes to strip a minority of rights, is that democracy or tyranny? When courts strike down a popular referendum, is that liberalism protecting rights or elites overriding the people? There's no clean answer. And Schmitt was right that the tension has never been resolved, only managed. His historical evidence was devastating. The Weimar Republic tried to maintain both. In 1933, the German people used democratic mechanisms, elections, legislative majorities, constitutional procedures, to dismantle every liberal protection in the Constitution. Democracy ate liberalism from the inside. And then Schmitt made his second cut. When powerful states invoke universal human rights or international law to justify their foreign policy, who do you think is actually deciding what counts as a human rights violation? Not some neutral arbiter, not humanity itself. The states with the most power, universalism, Schmitt argued, is just the costume that hegemony wears when it wants to look respectable. Now, Schmitt was wrong about a lot. We'll get there. But these critiques? They land. And the fact that they land is why he won't go away. This is the part of the video where things get uncomfortable. Because Schmitt isn't a historical curiosity. He is the intellectual skeleton beneath some of the most important political movements in the world right now. Here's where the story becomes more complicated. The Belgian philosopher Chantal Mouffe, self-described radical Democrat, major figure in left political thought, has spent decades building a left politics partially derived from Schmitt. Her argument: the reason liberal left politics keeps losing to populism is that it refuses to acknowledge the friend-enemy dimension. It keeps trying to do politics without actually doing politics. Technocratic centrism doesn't make conflict disappear. It just bores everyone until something angrier fills the vacuum. Mouffe's solution isn't to adopt Schmitt wholesale. It's to transform his antagonism into what she calls agonism, keeping the recognition that politics is real conflict while refusing to dehumanize your opponents. They're adversaries, not enemies. You fight their ideas passionately, but you accept their right to exist in the arena. This framework shaped Podemos in Spain, influenced Corbynite Labour in the UK, echoed in the Bernie Sanders movement. And her core warning: if the center-left keeps pretending that all disagreement can be resolved through rational consensus and institutional process, Schmitt will keep winning, because he's the one telling the truth about what politics actually feels like. Now the critics. Because Schmitt is not the last word, not even close. Jürgen Habermas spent his career building the most thorough counter-argument. Where Schmitt says rational public discourse is a sham, Habermas says, then build better institutions for it. The problem isn't that democratic deliberation is inherently fraudulent, it's that our institutions don't support it well enough. Fix the institutions, don't abandon the project. Hannah Arendt offers something different. For her, genuine politics isn't about war and exclusion, it's about action in concert. Plural, different people building something together. The friend-enemy logic doesn't describe politics, for Arendt. It destroys politics by eliminating the space where real human freedom happens. And there's the structural problem that even Schmitt's most sympathetic readers can't solve. If the sovereign decides the exception, who decides whether the sovereign's decision is legitimate? Schmitt can't answer this, because answering it would require appealing to a law or principle above the sovereign. And he's already said the sovereign is above the law. His framework ends in pure, circular, arbitrary will. There's no break, no appeal, no check. And that's not a theoretical problem. That's the Holocaust, the gulags, every modern atrocity committed by governments declaring permanent emergency. The liberal democratic answer courts, separation of powers, constitutional review is imperfect. Schmitt showed us exactly how those imperfect constraints can fail. What he never showed us is that their failure was inevitable, or that the alternative was better. Reading Schmitt in 2026 is like studying a structural engineer who correctly identified serious cracks in a bridge, and then blew it up. His diagnosis can be separated from his prescription, carefully, critically, with eyes open. The tension between liberalism and democracy is real and unresolved. Emergency powers are genuinely dangerous and historically underestimated. The gap between liberal democracy's promises and its performance creates the conditions for authoritarian backlash. And yes, great powers invoking universal values to justify their particular interests is a real phenomenon, not a conspiracy theory. He concluded from all of this that liberal constraints should be abandoned rather than strengthened. He had no answer for what constrains the sovereign because he didn't want one. His friend, enemy framework, used as a governing doctrine rather than as an analytical lens, doesn't produce political clarity. It produces ethnic cleansing. That is not incidental to his ideas. That is their conclusion, historically tested. The philosopher who most clearly described the weaknesses of liberal democracy also helped bring about a regime that murdered millions of people. We don't get to resolve that. We have to think inside it. And maybe that's actually the most useful thing about Schmitt in 2026, not his answers, but his questions. Because the questions about where power really lives, about what holds democracy together under pressure, about what happens when the friend-enemy logic crosses the border of a democracy and starts dividing citizens against each other. Those questions are being answered right now. In real time, in multiple countries simultaneously. Whether or not anyone is thinking about Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt died in 1985. 96 years old. Unrepentant to the end. No apology for the Nazis. No regret about the people his ideas helped murder. He became, in his old age, a kind of dark pilgrimage site. Young intellectuals from across the spectrum would come to his study in the small German town of Plettenberg to sit with him. Left-wingers who hated what he stood for but couldn't argue with his analysis. Right-wingers who found in him a framework for everything they wanted to do. The fact that both the people who want to destroy liberal democracy and the people who want to save it find him indispensable, that is itself the most Schmittian thing imaginable. He defined the political, and then demonstrated catastrophically what that definition makes possible. The political is the total, and it is precisely because of this that it is the densest and the most intense. Carl Schmitt believed that politics ultimately reveals itself in moments of crisis, when someone must decide, and the rules suddenly become uncertain. For many, his ideas represent a dark temptation in political thought. For others, they are a brutally honest description of how power really works. But either way, Schmitt forces us to ask a question that never truly disappears. When the system breaks down, who decides what happens next?